Welcome back to Showdown, and joining me now from Canberra, two heavy hitters from either side of Parliament. The Infrastructure Minister and Leader of the Government in the House of Representatives, Anthony Albanese, and also the Liberal Senator and Liberal Party President of New South Wales, Arthur Sinodinos. Thanks for joining us, gentlemen.
Good to be with you, Chris.
Albo, if I could go to you first, I want to ask about the Greens and their worst policies. These are your alliance partners in the Gillard government, yet a number of senior Labor figures, including yourself, have been critical of them. What is it about the Greens that some of your own colleagues describe as being extreme?
Well, I think some of their views don't match with reality. Take in my area, they oppose Kingsford Smith Airport and call for its closure. They oppose Badgerys Creek Airport. They oppose Wilton Airport. You know, I understand how you could get into Sydney on a parachute out of a plane. I don't understand how you could get out. And it's that sort of, I guess, clash with reality that is of real concern to me. The other thing is that whenever the Greens political party have had control of something, which they have in my area, like our council recently, they had the Mayor of Ashfield, the Mayor of Marrickville, essentially they've used their purpose not to advance environmental objectives. I'm certainly an environmentalist. They've used it to essentially promote alternative state and federal and indeed international plans that aren't really in tune with what the philosophy of the Greens political party voters think. I think there's a real disconnect between the representatives who all think or thought they were voting for Bob Brown and the actual candidates and what they do on the ground.
Why is that the case? Do you think they're misleading about what they stand for?
Oh, look, I think in many cases they're frustrated internationalists who get a base in local government and can get a quota, so try and engage in those sorts of issues. And they also, I think, it's very easy when you're not attempting to be a party of government, when you're not trying to get 51% of the vote, to just be all about platitudes. So it doesn't have to add up, the economics, for example, of proposals. And it doesn't, one of the things I've been frustrated by as the Transport Minister, take a project like the Moorebank Intermodal project, supported by this government, supported by the O'Farrell government, something that is important for Sydney, will take 3,300 trucks off the road. But if you're a group that's based upon populism and opposing any infrastructure development, because there's a group, any infrastructure plan, you'll have some opposition to it, then you end up opposing it. I await with interest the Greens political party response to the high-speed rail study that comes out, because you can't build a high-speed rail line without having all sorts of issues in terms of development issues for the entire East Coast.
Well, exactly. It'll take up a lot of land. I suppose when it comes to the money, they'll just ask for increased taxes on the rich. But I just want to go to Arthur Sinodinos now. And Arthur, I suppose we expect the Liberals to oppose the Greens because they're the far left of the spectrum, I suppose, compared to where you are. But they're a legitimate political force, aren't they? They compete by the rules, and they've won, 10 seats in Parliament. So why is there a need to attack them?
Look, Chris, it's a free country. They can run. But our job is to expose them. Anthony made a point before about the disconnect between people who vote for the Greens and what Greens policies actually are. And when you take the time to explain to people what some of the policies are and how contradictory they are, people start to see that these people are more interested in pushing their own policies than they are in really doing anything which is more broadly in the public interest. I've seen a number of cases where Greens MPs and others are not really interested in supporting normal constituent concerns. They regard that as probably a bit bourgeois. They tend to be people who think they have certain important causes which must be prosecuted. They are morally absolute. They are morally superior to the rest of us in the political process, and they act accordingly. And I think that grates on a lot of people in politics, and I think it's starting to grate on the electorate, particularly when, as we saw in the local government elections in New South Wales, this focus on broader issues, including international issues, was at the expense of the bread and butter stuff that local government is there to provide. I think Now that they're in positions of power, decision-making positions, there's more scrutiny of them, people start to ask the right questions, and I think they're getting the answers they need to make up their minds about the Greens. The other point I'd make is that when a group like this starts to get successful, and it had environmental origins, all sorts of other fringe and far left groups in this particular case tend to try and attach themselves to it, and by association get a power they could not otherwise win through the ballot box. I think that's part of what's happening in New South Wales.
I'll come back to you on that, but they're exercising their power, aren't they, as a balance of power party? Now, you used to work for John Howard and you dealt with the Democrats in exactly the same way. They exercised their power and forced changes to the GST, for instance. The Greens are just doing exactly the same sort of thing, aren't they?
Comrade, this group will never have anything to do with us, and that's part of the issue. They're not acting as a true balance of power party in that sense. They might agree with us on something for opportunistic reasons from time to time. I don't think they exercise the balance of power in that way. Essentially what they want to do is pursue a certain agenda of their own. They get what they want, they wait, and then they start to get a little bit more. And that's why I think the alliance with the government has been to the government's disadvantage, because ultimately the Greens are about taking as much as they can. They give very little in return, and then they come around the next day and start to ask for the next thing. And I think it can be very destructive, the way in which they've sought to exercise that so-called balance of power.
Well, Anthony Albanese, you're sitting there with a Liberal senator, Liberal and Labor both attacking the Greens as being divorced from reality, yet you're the government that has put them into an alliance arrangement. And of course, you're the one who's helped deliver their promise of a carbon tax, even though you promised not to deliver it. So aren't you dancing to the tune of these unrealistic Greens?
No, let's be clear here, Chris. It was indeed the Labor Party that put up an emissions trading scheme, a price on carbon. We had an agreement, of course, with the coalition that was torpedoed by the coalition and the Greens political party in the Senate. The second time around, importantly, because two Liberals crossed the floor to vote with Labor for a price on carbon, if the 5 Green senators at that time had just got up off their chair, walked across the chamber, there would have been a price on carbon. There would have been an emissions trading scheme during the last period of Parliament. And it wasn't Labor that put Adam Bandt on the lower house seat, which he occupies. It was Arthur's colleagues in the Victorian Liberal Party who chose to give Adam Bandt preferences ahead of the Labor candidate, as they have in my seat at every single election in which I've contested.
Well, we could talk about the carbon price all night, and you're right, the Greens have blocked it in the past, but delivered it.
Recall it, Chris.
I do recall it indeed. But let's go to some more recent history, and we just saw a backflip from your government last week on banning the super trawler. Weren't you again dancing to the Greens' tune then? The opposition to the super trawler, which had effectively been approved, was generated by the Greens in cahoots with Greenpeace and GetUp.
Absolutely not. I was opposed to it. Have a look at my comments from day one. I was very concerned that what we were being told in terms of the science was you can work out what the impact would be on not just the pelagic fish, but on those species that feed off the pelagic fish after the event. This is a new development in terms of the super trawler. This was the second largest vessel in the world. We don't know what the impact would be, and I adopt the precautionary principle when it comes to issues such as this. Importantly, Labor's been trying to get our bill through the Senate, and it's been delayed not just by the coalition but by the Greens. It still hasn't got through the Senate. We attempted on Monday to put in place mechanisms to ensure the passage of that legislation. It's now Tuesday night. It's not going through, and there are political games being played. And my key point with the Greens is that just like the Liberals and Labor, we accept we're political parties, myself and Arthur. They pretend they're not. They pretend they're a community organisation, and when people examine it, they're another political party that are pretty ruthless in the way that they exercise political power, and we're seeing that with some games being played over the passage of this legislation, even though the Greens political party agree with us that the precautionary principle should apply here.
Well, you mentioned earlier the way the Greens get elected on a local platform and then play some international politics, for instance. You're obviously referring then to the BDS campaign against Israel in your own area of Marrickville. But Arthur Sinodinos, you've also raised issues lately of Senator Lee Rhiannon associating with 9/11 truthers. These are people who suggest it was not Al-Qaeda who brought down the Twin Towers.
Yeah, Chris, she's been playing footsie with these characters, and while she'll claim, well, I've got to see all these constituents, the fact is that her website also promoted people going to meetings that these groups were holding. And since then, I've had emails from some of these people, and they're pretty loopy views. And what I was trying to do last week was just draw attention to the fact that we have a responsibility as leaders of the community on some of these issues, particularly in the week of 9/11, to say where we stand. And I was just concerned that Lee Rhiannon's been allowed to get away with some pretty dubious statements and potential support for groups that are saying some pretty nasty things that in some cases do border on the anti-Semitic. She accused me of accusing her of that. I was essentially saying, look, these are the sort of groups you're playing around with, and I linked that also to the boycotts, divestments and sanctions stuff that's been going on in places like Leichhardt, and I applaud that Anthony and others have been at the forefront of trying to stop some of that stuff happening, because all of that stuff stops us from actually promoting the sort of amity and cooperation that might actually lead to some sort of breakthrough in the Middle East. Well, and I just think this stereotyping of groups, including Israel, is standing in the way of that process.
Well, just briefly, Arthur Sinodinos, do you think that the Greens have passed their high water mark, that they're on the way out? And secondly, will the Liberals preference against them everywhere at the next election?
Look, on the latter issue first, I can't speak for the party as a whole, but we did. Anthony's right. We learned a lesson out of what happened in Adam Bandt's seat, and that's why Ted Baillieu in Victoria didn't preference them ahead of Labor. He learnt that lesson, and we're going to look at very closely at all of that. I think they have reached a high water mark because now they're coming under increasing scrutiny. It's true that they can often be a party of protest, particularly for people on the left who, for whatever reason, are not happy with the Labor Party. But we're going to be doing our best to maintain that scrutiny in the period ahead. And can I say, on issues like carbon tax, they did encourage Labor to break a solemn election promise from the 2010 campaign. Labor is paying a high price for having broken that promise.
Well, Anthony Albanese, you, of course, are critical of the Greens, but you remain in alliance with them in government and undoubtedly will be relying on their preferences to do as well as you can at the next election.
Look, we have many common interests. We have some common interests as well with Arthur and his mob, and I think where you can get some agreement across the board, agreement is always better than conflict. However, we have a very different worldview. I must say, though, that in terms of their supporters, many of their supporters are people who I would have very few disagreements with at all. I really think there is a disconnect there. Bob Brown's someone I had enormous respect for, I must say. It doesn't mean I agree with everything that he stood for. I don't. But I do think he was someone who was absolutely genuine. He was someone in the dealings I had with him, could keep his word. And he, as we all know, was opposed to measures such as the simplistic and counterproductive BDS campaign that Marrickville Council conducted. This was a very negative move. The idea that a local council is going to ban anyone who'd done business with Israel or had done business with companies with Israel. The sort of absurdity of demonstrations against Max Brenner's hot chocolate shops is just something that I think is out of place in Australia. We're a tolerant community. I'm a big supporter of Palestinian self-determination. I support a Palestinian state. I also support an Israeli state. And it's that simplistic, you've got to be on one side or the other. The truth is that in order to benefit the Palestinians, there needs to be a solution. Part of that has to be a solution that is a common solution in the interests of both Palestinians and Israelis. Now, that doesn't suit the sort of simplistic mantra that we saw with the BDS campaign, but I think it's absolutely the right way to go, and I was very concerned that my local community was divided by this issue.
I couldn't agree with you more on that one, Anthony Albanese. Thanks very much for joining us tonight, and also thanks to Arthur Sinodinos. Appreciate both your company tonight, and we'll have Senator Lee Rhiannon to respond to all that after the break.